Of breaking international law, governments and international observers are questioning the Jewish state's legitimacy of targeting civilians in its supposed pursuit of Hamas in Gaza. Palestinian casualties have been mounting since Israel intensified military operations in Gaza. 2 weeks ago, Human Rights Chief Navi Pillay voiced serious doubts that Israel's military campaign complies with international law. That law bans the targeting of civilians during war. In other words, is Israel maybe flouting international law? To discuss this, we're joined in studio by Professor of International Law at the University of Johannesburg, Professor Mia Swart. Professor, good morning to you and welcome to AM News.
Thank you very much.
Let's talk about this. Briefly tell us about the rules of engagement when it comes to war and stipulate for us what needs to happen in such a situation.
Well, the law regulating war is international humanitarian law. And you just mentioned that Navi Pillay 2 weeks ago already said that, Israel could be in violation of international law. But by now, there could be little doubt that this is the case.
Why is that?
Because there are certain principles in international humanitarian law that cannot be violated under any circumstances, such as the principle of proportionality, which means that you shouldn't use a hammer to kill a fly. The principle of distinction, which means that you should always distinguish between combatants and civilians, which I believe Israel is certainly not doing at this stage.
So what you are saying, Israel is in breach of international
Yes.
law, of human rights law.
No, it's international human
Yes.
rights law and international humanitarian law, actually.
So
Yes.
it's both in breach. Okay, so there is speculation that Israel may be experimenting with banned weapons. What are the legal consequences for countries and states that engage in such offences?
Well, of course, this is still speculative, so I would prefer not to comment on it too much. This was also speculated to be the case in the previous war. Of course, if it should be the case, I'm sure that it would strengthen the case for intervention. Yes.
Now, like any other sovereign state, does Israel not have a right to defend itself when they are being attacked?
Well, of course, this is the rhetoric one hears over and over by the Israeli ambassador, by the Israeli statesmen who are now appearing on TV all over the world, right? But it's always within the bounds of proportionality. Also, one has to remember that Israel is occupying Gaza, right? So the Gazans are effectively locked up, which totally changes the situation. It means that, they have nowhere to go, they have nowhere to run, that, Israel keeps saying that they're warning people to evacuate. Where should they go to? Also, it's such a densely populated area that it just doesn't seem realistic to say, oh, we are issuing these warnings.
Now, we're talking about densely populated, especially in the Gaza Strip.
Right.
The inhabitants there are 1.8 million Palestinians, we believe. Could targeting those people amount to crimes and crimes against humanity, for that matter?
Well, targeting civilians is a crime against humanity. Now, Israel would argue that it's not targeting civilians because of these warnings, etc. But if you're going to attack in such a densely populated area, it's inevitable that you're going to hit civilians. So with that knowledge, you shouldn't be acting that way. And it can be said that in effect you are targeting civilians. It's just not realistic to think you're only going to, hit the places where the rockets are being launched, Hamas headquarters. That's simply not possible. You cannot have a pinpoint operation, this is the words they're using, in such a densely populated area.
Because they're saying that they are targeting Hamas, particularly.
Yes, of course they're saying that. But they now see that the children are dying. 25% of the victims are now children. And they see this happening, yet they're not ceasing. Now,
over the weekend, U.S. President Barack Obama cautioned against Israel's threat to escalate military offensive. Now, a long-time ally of Israel, that is the U.S. What do you make of that?
Well, I think that it is only Obama and John Kerry, who can effectively influence the views of Netanyahu. So they're extremely important in this conflict. And it seems as if overnight this morning, Obama has finally called very strongly for a ceasefire. John Kerry, I believe, has traveled to Israel today, or is traveling to Israel today. So I think that there is increasingly a recognition that they have to play a role in also sort of telling Israel not to continue, but they're very, very cautious in the words, in the language they're using, which I think is wrong.
Now, the latest incident and the latest attacks from Israel and the attacks from Hamas into Israel is because of 3 youths that were killed. Apparently, as the Israelis are saying, that it was done by Hamas. But
Yes.
this war stretches way back than that. 1947, yes. as far as I can recall.
Yes. Or some say even before that, you know. But the point is that when Israel became a state in 1948, there was immediately conflict, even the next day. So, of course, it's difficult not to also understand the Israeli point of view. But with this particular conflict, and also with the 2009 conflict, the disproportionality has been so gross, you know, that I actually think that it is no longer realistic to say that there are two sides of the conflict. Because the moment one sees children dying to this extent, you know, you have to become... you know, you have to see it as going beyond even political viewpoints or religious viewpoints. The bottom line is there are children dying.
Now, Hamas considers the establishment of Israel's settlements in Palestine as illegal territories. What does the law say with regards to that? When we talk about the existing framework of where Gaza is situated and where Israel is currently?
Well, I believe that the occupation in Gaza is illegal, that you cannot, you know, close borders and restrict people to such a, you know, a lifestyle where you are disadvantaged on so many levels. And it can be seen as an ethnic project because, you know, you have the Jewish state of Israel and then you have Palestinians so separate, which is also why it's been called apartheid, which I have some doubts about. But in international law, I believe that it's not sustainable to keep Gaza occupied, to keep the West Bank occupied, and that it seems now that there will be a one-state solution instead of a two-state solution.
Because
yes.
the word two-state solution has been bandied about for quite some time.
Yes, at this point I think it's very unlikely. Yes.
Now, historically, Israel takes the kidnapping of its soldiers apparently quite serious.
Yes.
Now, with the latest claim of a kidnapped soldier from Israel, how much is this of a game changer in this current war? Might escalation maybe from Israel?
Of course, there's now been about 20 Israeli casualties, which could have two effects. The 20 casualties plus the kidnapping could have two effects. It could either strengthen Netanyahu in his resolve to keep the ground offensive going, or, you know, public pressure in Israel could lead him to say, no, we stop the offensive or the ground operation. My sense is that what Hamas, you know, is really now pushing for in terms of the ceasefire conditions is that the re-arrest of some of their, you know, prisoners, you know, was wrong and that they should be freed. So it's a game on both sides. It's just that I don't think it was right for Israel to re-arrest, you know, prisoners who've already been released. And that number, again, exceeds the number of the Israeli, you know, the one who was taken now. Yes.
Now, how do laws of prisoner of war apply since there is no independent Palestinian state there?
Well, the question, this is a good question, because the question is this an international armed conflict or non-international armed conflict? And since Palestine, the statehood is still disputed, if one disputes the statehood, you will say it's a non-international armed conflict, and then certain rules apply. And if, of course, you know, you see it as a separate state, which increasingly is the case, then you would see it as an international armed conflict. But the Geneva Conventions apply nevertheless, because it applies to both non-international and international armed conflicts. And there are many arguments now that says that Israel is in breach of the Geneva Conventions, for example, when it comes to collective punishment.
Now, many Israelis rather, have some connection to the military, since the army is largely based on conscription.
Right.
Do you foresee any shift in the public opinion amongst Israelis at this point in time?
Are you referring to conscription specifically?
No. In terms of conscription, not only, but in terms of the war that's being waged against Gaza, would they maybe say that we need to change this in terms of conscription and not participate in that?
Well, I don't think conscription will change anytime soon. There's a great amount of fear, some would say paranoia, but I think also legitimate fear within Israel, because thousands of rockets have hit them over, say, more than a decade, right? So I don't think that they would end conscription. They might even step up their attempts to draw the population into defending Israel. Yes, I just think that when you are within Israel, you know, the news that you receive is also a bit different from the information you receive when you're on the outside.
So it's not really about conscription, it's more about the ideology around it.
Exactly.
In the state of Israel. Professor, thank you so much for your time and joining us here on AM News and for the clarity that you've given us.
Big pleasure,
for joining us. That was Professor Mia Swart, the Professor of International Law at the University of Johannesburg.